talking about is this idea. I recently, in my travels, talking about the sufficiency currency, the European Eco Village organization suggested that I collaborate with another person. And the project that they're doing is a project where the idea would be, with promises of future services, you could fund what you're doing right now. So that might be useful in getting through a crisis or something like that. Oh, I need some cash now. I'm going to promise you that I'm going to give you a massage in the future, or zucchini in the future, or whatever it is. Let's say I write white papers and I need some cash right now. So I sell those services of writing a certain number of words or a certain number of business plans, and you pay me in advance. And now, anytime in the future, you're holding a voucher where you could call me in on that. Okay, it's not the same as being able to get forgiven a debt. It's not the same as defaulting from a bank. It's like, okay, I owe, 10 pages to Emmanuel and 10 pages to Alex and 20 pages to Ari and 10 pages to Tom, and, and forever and ever. And I know them and like them, and they help me out in a bind. They're not a bank. And now I'm kind of in this indentured slavery position. Now I've got to work twice as hard at some point in my life to make that same income because I took a debt based on my hours. And it doesn't matter whether it's I'm a masseuse or whether I'm baking you a cake or whether I'm whatever it is. It's a kind of a different kind of debt. And if I took a loan from you, I said, look, Emmanuel, I need a loan, and I had to ask you to forgive me the loan, it's still really different than I owe you a white paper that I never wrote for you. And now you call me up and like, hey, that website you said you're writing for me, I need it right now. And I say, look, whatever, I have repetitive stress injury, or I can't do it right now because I've got a ton of other work, or I've got to work all night to do it. It's very different than saying, hey, listen, I can't pay you back. Can I pay you back and pay, whatever it is, if I needed to pay you back that money?
Well, we're dealing with energy, and it's an Australian initiative. There's lots of sun in Australia, so it's obvious to put solar panels out there, and therefore it's a infrastructure heavy thing to install solar panels.
Yeah.
Money needs to come in somehow. How do we allow money to come in without ceding all authority and control to those people who have money? And the rough bones of what we're proposing is, rather than saying we'll pay interest to people with money, why don't we share in the productive output of the solar panels? Now, that can obviously be applied to anything where you have to pay money up front for infrastructure cost. So maybe it's the bread oven, or maybe it's the tractor in your field, and then you're going to get productive output in the future because of that investment. So you share it.
That's interesting because I have the exact same project.
We don't think we're the only people with this idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's perfect. I mean, I don't mind if you talk about it here because it's very, very relevant to the sufficiency currency. Because one of the questions that we got from Gen Europe was, well, obviously the eco villages are agricultural. So what else needs to come into the picture? And energy was the first one. Energy cooperatives was the first obvious thing. So I'd love to, maybe you want to say a few words about what you're doing, Emmanuel, because I do think it is relevant to this call.
The idea would be to use the same technology. It was a technology from All Power Labs. It's a company in the US, and to revalorize bio waste that we have here in the community, because we have 4 different sawmills and they generate 6 tons of wood a day. So we could take that wood, chip it, and use and put it, process it in the gasifier and generate electricity for the community. And to be able to raise the capital expenditures needed to import the technology, install it, and everything. The idea was twofold. So on one side, the idea was to, or is to go and basically just get an investor, just very straightforward investment with interest. The other idea is to have a crowdfunding towards the stakeholder. If you are in the village and you have an electricity bill, which is pretty much everyone, you're a potential stakeholder for our project. And the idea would be to have a fundraising activity towards people that have the capital that could pay, let's say, 3 months or 6 months or a year of electricity in advance at a rebate rate.
Exactly right. That's essentially the idea. Instead of increasing the amount of money, you give more product for the same amount of money.
Exactly.
So your money remains constant, but the amount of product you get for your money increases. That gets rid of the problem associated with money, which is money generating more money, because money generating more money is a no-cost activity, and yet you've suddenly, here you are, you've done nothing, and yet you've now got more money. Well, that's a pretty good business to be in, isn't it?
So Tom and Kevin have a similar project, and Emmanuel has the same idea of using, using some capital from the people who will use the electricity to build the energy plant with a different kind of regenerative technology. And one of the things that we distinguished is it's really, really different depending on the kind of thing that you're producing. So if you're producing plants like an agricultural product, there's a lot of risk involved. And if I'm asking the community to pay for my seeds and the harvest doesn't turn out well, I have this kind of personal problem, personal debt that builds up. Whereas with an energy plant, because it goes on for many years, there's less risk for me personally. And if I'm just a massage artist or a technical writer and I owe you 50 pages and I owe Kevin 20 pages and I owe Tom another 20 pages, and someday at the future you call me, there's a very different feel. And how specific that kind of IOU voucher is, and how good of a funding mechanism that is depends on the type of project. I would say what you're doing is you're giving people something they were going to have to pay for anyway, for a little bit less money, and a little bit more risk. And that seems really fair. I think this is a very, it's really interesting because every time we go into these conversations, they're so nuanced because this idea of going into debt to the bank is so different than going into debt that I'm going to have to pay you back with my time, which is very different than this idea of production of energy. And that's different from, so when I'm thinking about agriculture, I'm like, well, that's a great way to, in some ways, that could be a good way to fund agriculture too, because you could buy the seeds and the fertilizer in the land and then have it, get the food back. The problem with that is it's a very different nature, because if it's the seeds, that's just a one-year harvest. And if it goes bad that year, then you're in trouble the next year. Whereas if it's an energy plant of any kind, whether it's renewable energy or regular energy plant, you're really just funding whatever it is, enough energy for the first year, let's say, but you still keep using that same plant. So you're not really, there's not as much risk. There's not as much of a situation where you guys end up in debt that you can never pay back because this energy plant keeps producing energy. Whereas with the farmers, the reason they're in, they end up in debt in those situations is one bad year and it's like, it's bust. And so it's that nuance of what you're paying for exactly and what does it take to pay it back is so important in this particular voucher-based model. Like there's all kinds of ways you can imagine solving those kinds of problems where certain job, like creating food in permaculture way or an ecologically sustainable way, is a lot more labor intensive than continuing to produce energy in a sustainable way. The initial work is there, but after that, it's not there. Whereas, harvesting and planting is very seasonal and very labor intensive.
Good point you bring up, Grace, because this is something that comes to my head also from industrial age perspective. When you have a factory, when you've already set up a factory, then it's just selling products and then they can make money off it all the time. And that's the kind of, as long as the demand is there, because it's so much overproduction that so much capacity has already been invested at the upfront and so much overproduction is happening that they need to capitalize on it and become billionaires or something like that. So is that where the disconnect is happening in the society, where people are just creating these overcapacity and then they are just pushing this marketing campaign to push people to force into the services?
So it's not overcapacity, right? It's certain things are easy to reproduce also, right? Software, once you've developed it, reproducing another one has no overhead. Music. So if you look at the music industry, I mean, that's a completely distorted industry where these recording artists now all of a sudden all have to go on tour because all the money's going to the recording companies. It's really that's a bizarre distortion, right? Because the cost of making more music is nothing. So why are those people in such financial distress? I mean, you just see that there's something so corrupt about the system. But in the software industry, that's what it is, right? There's this thing called profit, and the more you make of it, and the upfront costs are very widely. And I think that the simple example that we're giving here is just really simple, right? If you have, let's say, a community of people, and this community of people has decided we're no longer going to use money, we're going to use the sufficiency currency. And what our job is to take care of everybody in the village. And look, we've got a solar power plant and we can produce enough solar power. And if it were all in one village, you just say, okay, and we take turns doing whatever needs to be done there, whatever is cleaning the solar panels, or I don't know what needs to be done, right? And just like we take turns taking out the garbage and take turns working in the fields. When you isolate that, okay, these guys, Kevin and Tom, do the solar panels, and Sharon, apparently, she does the farming based on that background. And so she's got to work a lot more hours over and over every year at certain times of the year than Kevin and Tom do. And since they don't live in the same village, but they're just in the same sharing economy, Kevin and Tom could be like, that's not fair. We have so much energy, we could just sell it instead of give it to you for free. We're supporting 20 eco villages and they're just supporting the two of us. I mean, how much zucchini can we eat? Whereas Sharon might say that's not fair. Kevin and Tom are sitting on their asses all the time. The rest of us down here in the eco villages, they're just like looking at solar panels and wiping solar panels twice a day. And we're sitting here like, have you ever picked zucchini? You get prickles all over you and you work all day and you only get about, like 50 kilos for 4 people and you're busting your ass. And that's after it grew and you weeded it and those guys are bums, right? The inequality of that particular thing is so, like those two perspectives are so like, wait a second here. And that's where our society has this thing about, like profit doesn't represent hard work, although we've been told that, work hard, the people who, and Kevin and Tom are also talking about that. Like just having money in the bank that makes money.
So I have a question about exactly that. How do you propose to measure the flows with the currency and then model the way to, let's say we have an excess capacity in this area, and then that means that we will want to use that excess capacity for a new project that will eat that excess capacity, right? So how does your currency does those links, and how does it measure? How does that work?
The flows are where things are being redistributed to, right? So you've got a pool, and then you could say, okay, what you want to measure is, okay, I've got a pool of this, or you might say, I need a pool of this, right? This is how much food I need, this is how much energy I need, this is how much whatever it is, right? These are my needs, and this is my availability. And then where did it go? Where did it come from and where did it go? Right? So that might be this village produced energy and that produced zucchini, and then they got distributed that way. So those are the flows.
Great question. And as you can tell, the calls are not pre-scripted, so the answer kind of went really windy. So we're going to spare you that. But we will be talking about that topic. Like when you have a regenerative community or a community-owned business and there's some profit, what do you do with that? How do you decide to reinvest it? Do you reinvest it? Who does the money go? All those questions that'll be the topic of one of our weekly calls. These weekly calls, as you can tell, they're quite wide-ranging. We put together these summaries for you. The calls are between an hour and a half, and you're welcome to come. It's Wednesdays on Central European time, it's 5 p.m. Eastern time, it's 11 a.m. Eastern US time, and I don't know what the heck time it is for those guys in Australia who come every week. It's an amazing call, as you can tell, people from all around the world interested in how to create regenerative economies. And each week we talk about different topics. You can join and just jump in on whatever the topic happens to be for the week, which is usually what's come up that week. Or you can write to me and say, hey, can we talk about this topic? And we'll pick up on your topic on a week that you can show up. So drop me a line, register for the call, just show up for the call. We're happy to have you. And thanks again for watching the Voice of Humanity Sufficiency Currency project videos. Thanks.